Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagement. And today we're going to talk about the anthropologist Chris Knight's article on the late David Graeber. Did Communism Make Us Human? Or the Anthropology of David Graeber. This was originally published in Vulgar and Rail in 2021, shortly after Graeber's death. I have been in some correspondence with Chris Knight in the past. I would love to invite him on the show again, deal with the time zone trains between our two countries, and talk a bit about Graeber. But we'll see if that happens in the future. Did Communism Make Us Human? On the Anthropology of David Graeber by Chris Knight. Quote, the first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him, that man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes, or filling up the ditch, or crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone once you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody." Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, 1755. Chris Knight's work begins here. My friend David Graeber's certain death last year, 2020, came as a great shock. More than anyone since Friedrich Engels, he succeeded in digging anthropology out of the shadows and making it seem empowering to ordinary people. Asterisk. I think it's true, but I think there's a lot on that word "seem," and we'll come back to that. As a politically active anthropologist, we had much in common, but for two anarchists to agree on everything would be astonishing. Graeber's delight in being provocative could be hugely creative. I agree on that, actually. He enjoyed telling his friends that everything I believe about human history is just plain wrong. Dismissing traditional theories about primitive communism. Even though he was a student of Marshall Solons, and Marshall Solons' Stone Age economics actually looks like primitive communism. For those of you who want to go there, I would read Marshall Solons' Stone Age economics. I think it's actually a very good book. And dismissing Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas on the origins of human equity, he said that we were all just fairy tales. No society was ever based on the principle that the fruits of the earth belong to all, and the earth itself to nobody. There is never a prehistoric paradise in which society was won along communist lines. Which I think is funny. That's a lot of way people read The Dawn of Everything. He's actually arguing that it was. And yeah. As soon as Graeber's debt, the first 5,000 years, hit the streets in 2011, it was acclaimed not only by anarchists, socialists, and anti-capitalists, by some of the world's top economists. It was also hated by some of the world's top economists too, but we'll go back on that. Early on in the book, Graeber devotes several pages on the topic of communism. Instead of treating it as the dream of common ownership as a political program, Graeber redefines communism as any human relationship that operates on the principles from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Which is, something that Marx says is the ultimate goal of communism. But any relationship that does that, even abstractly, yeah, that's not a political economic mode. But Graeber didn't believe in political economic modes. Since relationships of this kind are to be found everywhere, Graeber can claim to be bringing us down to earth, celebrating communism as not just an ideal, but an everyday reality, the foundation of all human social life. Yeah, and this is very wrong. Qualifying this, Graeber says that since selfish competitive relationships are also found everywhere, communism can never be a stable arrangement. In his words, all of us act like communists a good deal of the time, none of us act like communists consistently. Well, I would agree with that to some degree, but again, a political economy and vibes are not the same thing, Graves. Long before Graeber arrived on the scene, evolutionary science had been debating on whether humans differ from other primates in being instinctively disposed to cooperate where possible. Yes, you see that in Trotwilling information, but I'll come back to that. As always, there are arguments not everyone agrees, but in addition to cooperation with friends and relatives, the Darwinian social struggle labeled cooperation with strangers has become widely recognized as part of the psychological makeup of our species. Yeah, we don't eat other people's babies of our own species generally if we have any idea that they belong to our proxy group, even if we don't know them. That's a hominid trait. Graeber's contribution was relabeling exercises designed to shock, horrify, and delight. Of all things, Graeber can close describe everyday sociability as communism. After decades of Cold War and endless warnings about the Red Menace and the need for the U.S. to lead the free world in opposition to communism, after all this, Graeber had the audacity to simply state that we were communists when we were at our kindest and best. Yeah, and that sounds like a good rhetorical trick, except it's a brilliant move that actually is very liberal. We'll come back to that in a minute. I think Knight agrees with me on here. It was a brilliant move, and of course it worked. But part of the attraction was that it could please everyone. Bingo! Unlike Marx's version of communism, which might threaten the owners of capital, Graeber's version leaves property relations intact. There is no trace here of Rousseau's declaration that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody. Communism, according to Graeber's new definition, has nothing to do with how property is owned. In fact, the good news is that you can have private property, feudalism, corporate monopoly, capitalism, slavery, or whatever, and still enjoy the benefits of communism. As I've heard all the critics say, no wonder some bankers loved it. Well, they also loved the implications of some of the implicit MMT of the book, but we'll come back to that later. Graeber argues explicitly that communism tends to emerge everywhere, irrespective of how property is owned. His reasoning is simple. Solidarity, pleasures will always exist, but for most human beings, the most pleasurable activities always involve sharing something: music, food, liquor, drugs, gossip, drama, beds. There is a certain communism of the senses at root of most things we consider fun. God, this part of debt has always been, and his thought after that has always been, I think, a patently dishonest rhetorical move, but nonetheless. Even capitalist firms as the Apple Corporation foster communism internally to encourage their employees to socialize freely and speak to one another creatively. Asterisk. I am going to say, even in Marx and Engels, there is a sense in which socialized labor, and by that I don't mean socialized as in owned by the government or even socialized as in socialist, owned by all. I mean socialized as in socializing labor. Cooperative labor, combined action, actually is a socializing force that lays the groundwork for socialism. But it isn't the same thing as socialism. This is a trend, and I did this on a whole series on the Patreon, where I talk about Graeber's tendency to say that because X is analogous to Y, it is the same as X. Like, because states are analogous to symbolic kinship, states are a form of symbolic kinship. They might emerge out of symbolic kinship, as most relational forms do, most politics do, because most relations of production have their first model in kinship and tribe. Nonetheless, they're not the same thing. There is a way in which the size and expansion of a concept fundamentally changes the concept. This is one of those times again. Graeber reminds us that you can't even enjoy everyday conversations and normal use of language without mutual trust, and therefore an element of communism. But it can only be an element. Skillfully deploying ethnographic illustrations, Graeber shows how, in cultures across the world and across historical time, what he terms communism comes and goes. Alternates with violent, selfish, and competitive principles, wins out sometimes, becomes crushed at other times, but never quite disappears. For we who are libertarian communist at heart, it is a comforting thought. Now we have something to fall back on. In final analysis, we cannot lose. It's funny how Graeber's whole politics is a concession to the status quo without admitting it. And I know that's going to make a lot of people mad, but it's true. All right. Yet Graeber is also telling us that we cannot win. Bingo. Traditionally, anarchists and socialists have hoped that one day we might govern ourselves along communist lines, just as we once did when humans were hunters and gatherers, and in some other rare scenarios with low surplus. According to Graeber, this is pure fantasy. Quote, long quote from Graeber, our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. Once upon a time, humans held all things in common in the Garden of Eden during the Golden Age of Saturn and the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands. He actually goes so far with this is Derek talking, that he eventually abandons the concept of hunter-gatherer as a coherent concept, which totally does damage to the anthropological categories, but nonetheless, And he ignores distinctions amongst hunter-gatherer categories so he can collapse them down and throw the weight a category. We'll come back to that later. Then came the fall, as a result of which we are now cursed with divisions of power and private property, the Lapsarian dream that I've heard MMTers talk so much about. This dream was that someday we would finally be in a position to put things back, to restore common ownership and common management of collective resources. We might call this mythic communism or even epic communism, a story we like to tell ourselves. Since the days of the French Revolution, it has inspired missing, but has also done enormous damage to humanity. It's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. According to Graeber, then, it is the left's time-honored dream of restoring common ownership which has done enormous damage to humanity. In contrast, I think we should put the finger in the opposite direction. More damaging than anything is surely right-wing assumptions that borders, warfare, male dominance, and private property have always existed and always will. The theory of primitive communism, according to Graeber, is no more than a fairy tale, a magical utopia. Paleolithic hunter-gatherer societies were never especially egalitarian, anarchistic, or communistic. Asterisk. I'm actually going to say that is a difference from his earlier arguments before debt. A lot of the flaws I see in Graeber I've seen very early, but that one's actually one that comes in right after Occupy, during and after Occupy Wall Street. In fact, in his view, they were no more likely to be than cattle herders, farmers, or city dwellers. Yeah, this is part of the dawn of everything. Graeber concedes that the social systems of our Paleolithic ancestors did incorporate interpersonal aspects of communism as he defines it, but in his view, the same can be said of all human societies everywhere, including modern capitalist ones. Quote, even capitalism can be seen as a system for managing communism, Graeber writes. Like any other social system, he explains, capitalism depends on spontaneous communism of all of us in our everyday lives. Isn't that fucking convenient? You can change everything and change nothing at all. And people have missed that. In repudiating the theory of initial or original communism, Graeber brushed aside an influential lineage of historical and evolutionary thought. I am thinking here of Lewis Henry Morgan, not an unproblematic figure, Barnes adding. There's some really fucked up stuff in his stuff, but nonetheless. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, followed by successive generations of scholars whose work among extant hunter-gatherers has shown that life is neither private property nor the state, is not only conceivable, but in practice and typically harmonious, resilient, and rewarding. When the eminent anthropologist Richard Lee, for example, published his reflections on primitive communism in 1988, he was speaking directly from his experiences of life among the Kalahari San hunter-gatherers. If you have participated recently in any anti-capitalist, environmentalist, or other direct action gathering, you will immediately recognize their social ethos as he describes it. These people, supposedly primitive, are in fact us. They have no top-down authority structure, no police force, no tolerance for loud mouths, and no hint of state power. All of their resources are commonly shared right down to children. They possess elaborate kinship systems which bind people together across vast landscapes, irrespective of territorial boundaries. Kinship systems are something Marxists don't deal with enough, and our family abolition doesn't deal with the function of kinship and symbolic mediation on our minds. I'm going to say that verbatim right now because this is a critique I have right now. When we often argue for family abolition, what we are arguing for the notions of kinship, as commonly understood in the bourgeois nuclear marriage, to be a historical particularity, and that the legal ramifications and binds, particularly on women, were not great. That was what Marxists traditionally meant by it. It's not what people mean by it now. But what's interesting about this is common sharing of raising of children are encouraging of many allo parents, non-biological parents in a society, is pretty common in high trust societies. I mean, I've even seen it in modern societies that still have some high trust around them. Low trust societies diminish this, and we in capitalist America are a very low trust society. All right. With each camp, they are assertively egalitarian, and their primary level mechanisms are raucous collective laughter directed against anyone trying to get above themselves. Sometimes it's violent, though. That needs to be recognized. In 2000, a quite extraordinary book, The Other Side of Even, was published by the social anthropologist and well-known hunter-gatherer specialist Hugh Brody. His gripping book is a masterpiece of narrative and scholarship, gathering together in one volume both the diversity of hunter-gatherer cultures and the core features they have in common. Tens of millennia ago, Brody wrote, the world's hunter-gatherer systems would have displayed an immense range of languages and cultural forms. Hence, of this diversity come across in hunter-gatherer populations we know today. Asterisk, yeah, people overgeneralize about hunter-gatherers, which is what led Graeber to throw the category out. But a huge diversity within a category does not imply the category is not real. There's a huge diversity in the proletariat. We don't imply that there's no such thing as a working class or the proletariat. All right. The indigenous peoples of the Americas speak hundreds of different languages, and all are clear about the many features that allow them to identify themselves as distinct nations or societies. In the forests and tundra of the North American subarctic and Arctic, where the environment is extreme and the landscapes are vast and relatively uniform, hunter-gatherers speak a large number of mutually unintelligible dialects that fall into 4 language families, as distinct from one another as the Romance languages of Western Europe are from the Bantu languages of Southern Africa. Linguists estimate that in California alone, Aboriginal populations spoke 80 different languages. The variety of hunter-gatherer ways of speaking, comments Brody, is a sign itself of the vast spans of time during which these social systems have been alive. The more different languages you spawn, the older your way of life is. All right. Languages, the author continues, create a potential for an immense panoply of social and familial arrangements. An apparently infinity of ways in which people can codify and convey knowledge, beliefs, and ideals. Despite this diversity, however, there are some characteristics that all hunter-gatherers have shared. These are grounded in a kind of relationship that hunter-gatherers establish in the world in which they live. Material well-being depends on knowing, as opposed to endlessly changing the environment. Many strategies of both hunting and gathering rely on management of the land, from selective burning of the brush and undergrowth to prevent uncontrollable forest fires, to replacing roots to ensure that abundant growth in the following year. Population densities are too low and foraging ranges too immense for anything to be gained by patrolling boundaries or attempting military attacks against neighboring groups. Many hunters say that wild animals will agree to be killed only if they are shown respect in both life and death. The ritual and habits of respect are therefore important ways in which hunters and gatherers are not passive harvesters, but are engaged in a complicated business of maintaining the world around them that ensures that its produce is bountiful. Asterisk. A lot of hunter and gatherer societies have notions of person that apply to animals. Okay, on asterisk. In short, the central preoccupation of hunter-gatherers' economic and spiritual systems is the maintenance of the natural world as it is. The assumption held deep within the point of view is that the place where people live is ideal. Therefore, it changes for the worst. It's essentially a conservative mindset, but this is where I'm talking. But it's one that maybe leftists can look at a little bit and try to understand things. If your way of life gives you joy and abundance, why seek to change it? It is only when hunting and gathering is way to cattle herding, farming, property accumulation in the state that there is a constant dissatisfaction with the way things are, leading to social breakdown and wars. From that point on, society is riddled with contradictions and endlessly unstable. Widespread frustrations now generates never-ending attempts to exploit nature more intensively. We become so accustomed to this that we forget how it all began. I mean, we've lost to forget how it all began. Only when a social system is constantly failing will people keep thirsting for social change. I'm going to read this again. Only when a social system is constantly failing will people keep thirsting for social change. Another characteristic of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is a deep respect for individual decisions. Communities have experts rather than leaders. Men and women whose skills are revered, but decisions on whether to follow their lead or take their advice are matters of individual choice. The conflation of expertise with coercion is a lot of reasons why today even modern common sense distrusts experts, because they see it as coercive. Now, this leads to a lot of nonsense, but the impulse is there because of the conflation in our economy, I think, anyway. A hunter leader does not instruct others to follow or take any particular directions. The expert makes his or her decisions known. Others then make their decisions following or not as each prefers. Social and ethical norms are powerful, but they are enforced by a minimum of instruction or organized retribution. Revenge is part of hunter-gatherer societies, okay? It's not idyllic in every sense. Beliefs about the effects of human actions on the spirit world contain implied threats. Failures to show the necessary respect for animals can result in hunger and sickness. But rules and the consequences of breaking them are embedded in the stories and advice of elders or in the diagnosis of shamans after things have gone wrong. Individual hunter-gatherer links and roots to the spirit world. Through dreams and through other forms of insight and intuition are paramount. Choice and freedom are set on each person, not constrained by social hierarchy. This is anarchism, and it works in certain conditions. Yeah. For years, my colleague Jerome Lewis has been working among the, oh dear God, Mintjele Bayaka, I think, egalitarian foresters, hunter-gatherers in the Congo. Sorry, Congolese, I can't say that. He describes their politics as an assertive, dynamic process that depends on a complex of interdependent practices that constantly resist the emergence of hierarchy, dependency, and inequality. In a manner typical of assertive, egalitarian hunter-gatherers, any hint of individual pride or personal dominance is dealt with using rough humor. Yeah, remember, humor is aggression masked so that it's not zero sum. All right, it's not the only form of humor. Humor does a lot of things, but that's part of it. That's what satire is, anyway. One communal form this takes among the Bayaka is mojo, a kind of mimicry or pantomime which may be used particularly to quell behavior that is deemed unacceptable or absurd. It would be too risky for a young person to make fun of an elder, no matter how foolish they were being. But senior women can exercise a special privilege, seeing it as their enjoyable role to use mojo to bring down anyone who seems to be getting too boastful or assertive. A widow or grandmother may start the ball rolling by silently imitating some of the mannerisms of her target, usually a man, in a way which accentuates its absurdity. One or two companions immediately grasp the identity of her target. The sounds of their unconstrained laughter are so contagious before long, everyone is rolling around while pantomiming the behavior being mocked. Eventually, the only person still straight-faced is the man himself. But laughter continues mercilessly until, ideally, even he gets a joke, seeing himself as foolish person he was being. The chorus then subsides as he finally joins in, now laughing at his own expense. A good mojo performance will succeed in calming the atmosphere by allowing everyone a good laugh and to forget their anger, while also still showing the aggression towards someone is showing dominance. I'm just saying the quiet part loud here. James Woodburn's fieldwork among the Hadza in Tanzania during the 1960s in many ways inaugurated the modern era of hunter-gatherer research. Woodburn divided hunter-gatherer societies across the world into two fundamental types according to whether they consume their food resources within hours or days. Immediate return hunter-gatherers, the more egalitarian ones, are practiced long-term storage, delayed return societies. When storage techniques are in use, certain sections of society typically claim responsibility for guarding and distributing the accumulated wealth, monopolizing this organized power in their own economic and political interests. The only way in delayed returns context, when wealth begins to be stored and accumulated, that private elite and social stratification begin to emerge. This is why it's primitive communism, because it is based on not having a lot of surplus. All right? Take only what you need when you need it. For tens of thousands of years, hunter-gatherer societies everywhere were the immediate return type, as are the bow and arrow hunting Hadza today. In these societies, no one owns a fruiting tree or an area where you can dig yams. No hunter can claim rights to the animal he has killed. All meat has to be brought back to the camp. Under those conditions, no one can claim to possess property or give it to selected others in return for their labor or allegiance. Instead, all resources are brought to the camp to be immediately distributed to what is termed demand sharing. This simply means that everyone with more than they personally need will face irresistible collective pressure to let others have their share. Most immediately returned hunter-gatherers, a woman will choose to live with her own mother throughout her life, inviting her male sexual partner to visit her in her own camp. Yeah, this makes sense because your brother will likely protect you more than the brother of your spouse, particularly if you're a woman. In an arrangement known as bride service, a young man will never acquire permanent sexual rights in the woman he regularly visits. Instead, he must continuously earn approval by surrendering all of his hunted meat to his mother-in-law for her to distribute as she pleases. In my own work, I have described this as a hunter's own kill rule. an arrangement which systemically denies hunters any right to consume or distribute meat from the animals they themselves kill. Just as well-organized women exercise their right to take hunter meat from men, children have the right to demand food from adults and cannot be refused. The same applies to the elderly, the frail, and anyone who cannot hunt or gather for themselves. Whether or not we describe this as communism is optional, but these are surely moral principles which any libertarian, communist, socialist, or anarchist would immediately recognize and celebrate. And here is the point. Unlike under capitalism, it is these communistic principles which are prevailing ones across society as a whole. Yes, there are still conflicts and outbursts of violence, but at no time does anyone derive status, property, or power over women from behavior of this kind. It takes the carteling of property to do that, which takes carteling of surplus. Now, we could talk about the societies that arrange surplus, because I do agree that Graeber is right that immediate return hunter-gatherers are not the only egalitarian society, but they are the primary one, and Dawn of Everything is actually kind of aimed at denying this. All right. In view of all this, it seems to me self-evident that communism has not proved not only a workable system, but the most long-lasting, resilient, and successful way of living ever invented by humans. So, I've always felt sad at the way Graeber would poke fun at me and my anthropological colleagues who stress this point. Every year at the London Anarchist Book Fair, we in the Radical Anthropology group would give a talk to a packed room arguing that societal arrangements of our Paleolithic hunter-gatherer ancestors were essentially communist, endorsing the traditional Marxist view that the family, private property, and the state had emerged only recently. The nuclear family, not all kinship bonds. That needs to be very clearly stated. Chris Knight. I know you know that, but that's for my audience. Among anarchists who don't like the state, this has long been the mainstream perspective. But Graeber would have none of it. In his recent writings, he argued that just as communist has already existed, so has the principle of coercion which underlies the state. I mean, sort of, but not in the way he means. Again, change in scale changes type eventually. Something like the state must always be present, and in the sense that sovereignty, defined by Graeber as the power of command, is an intrinsic component of all human social interactions. It's like Graeber read Engels' On Authority and decided it was correct, but he was going to use it to save anarchists, not to condemn it. That's a weird argument, but anyway. In support of this claim, he cites linguistic evidence. All human languages we know have imperative forms. And in any society, there will always be situations where it is considered appropriate for some individuals to tell others what to do. To me, that seems astonishing that Graeber could conflate such very different things as imperative linguistic forms and the state. Imperatives are not necessarily top-down. Among immediate return hunter-gatherers, the Hadza, for example, they frequently illustrate counter-dominance as children make demands of their parents and women instruct men how to behave. Graeber seems to be saying that the basic elements of state power are to be found everywhere, including in supposedly egalitarian hunter-gatherers. For example, he states that, quote, hunter-gatherers cannot be generally egalitarian because they have kings. I was thrown back when I first heard this assertion. Hunter-gatherers, Graeber reasons, typically believe in powerful spirits who might suddenly produce thunderstorm, torrential rains, or a whirlwind. And this is an argument from him and Marshall Solins, and Graeber has a dumber argument in that book. In many cases, prey animals are believed to be protected by such spirits ready to wreak punishment on any hunter who shows them disrespect. Associating all religion with sovereignty and state power, Graeber depicts hunter-gatherers as fearful people cowering in the faces of hostile and incomprehensible forces, no different in principle from those wielded by a divine king. In his own words, quote, most hunter-gatherers actually do see themselves as living under a state-like regime, even a terrifying despots. It's just that since we see their rulers as imaginary creatures, as gods and spirits, and not as flesh and blood rulers, we do not recognize them as real. But they are real enough for those who live under them. Hunter-gatherers, according to Graeber, differ only in that they deny their sovereigns any prospect of material embodiment. I mean, I do think there's something to the meta-person's theory, but I don't think Graeber's, again, X is analogous to Y, so X is Y, is all his fucking logic. He does this all the goddamn time. Anyway, as he explains, most hunter-gatherers have known plenty of kings. They have studiously avoided sovereign powers to fail in the hands of mortal humans, at least on any sort of ongoing basis, and usually in any form at all. Although their kings are immortal spirits, continues Graeber, they are real, just as real as corporeal kings, since everyone believes in them. He concludes that He concludes that because hunter-gatherers have kings, and that cannot be considered generally egalitarian. Of all of Graeber's provocative claims, this to me seems the most outlandish. Maybe he makes this claim because he's unfamiliar with hunter-gatherer systems of belief, or maybe he just enjoys being provocative. In any event, had he been less dismissive of hunter-gatherer studies, he would have never made such an elementary mistake. He would have known that, far from living in abject fear of their spirits, the Kalahari Bushmen, like other egalitarian hunter-gatherers, party with them and joke with them, awfully gleefully making obscene jokes at their expense. When God is a trickster, the whole idea of divine authority is essentially a belly laugh. When Richard Lee asked a Bushman informant whether he and his people recognize a headsman or a king, he told them, "Of course we have a headsman. In fact, we are all headsmen. Each of us is a headsman over himself." From this, we may conclude with Lee that the Bushmen are assertively egalitarian. When everyone is a king, no one is a king. Being well aware of the dangers of despotism, contemporary hunter-gatherers do not imagine that they can lie back and relax because egalitarianism has been achieved. There is always a danger that some individual might attempt to assert personal dominance, making people feel the need to establish and reestablish their egalitarian principles repeatedly and in highly sophisticated and psychologically and social ways. So freedom and despotism are in constant conflict. Although something like libertarian communism is what everyone recognizes as the best way to live. To such people, private ownership seems undesirable and self-defeating because they can't see the point of it. Where communism prevails, it is because everyone enjoys sharing their food, their songs, their laughter, their children, and when conditions are right, also their bodies in tactile solidarity, including sex. Taboos against abuse of human body and abuse of natural resources, including game animals, are certainly strong, but they emanate from below and have nothing to do with the state, aka we already figured out an answer to the problem of the commons, dipshit. All right. When we accept Graeber's point that no society is ever rigidly organized according to a single principle, invariably there will be rhythms, periodicities, and fluctuating mix of strategies and pressures, some generous and some cooperative, some less so. In fact, the essence of the trickster is precisely this alteration between opposite phases or states. Hunter-gatherers are well aware of the possibilities of cruelty, hierarchy, and despotism in human affairs. They also know how to turn these dangers on their heads. In view of all this, Graeber cannot be right when he denies that the essentially egalitarian communistic nature of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which has not only shaped our uniquely human emotions and instincts, because all of us are descended of hunter-gatherers, because that was all human beings at one point, but was ultimately responsible for our evolutionary success as a species. I don't want to be too negative. One of the best memories of Graeber was an excitement I felt on hearing him talk about communism to a mass audience. The very fact the subject was communism seemed extraordinary. He was breaking a taboo. Who talks about communism as a living inspiration these days? Well, more people today, but yes. We were all part of the Occupy movement in London and had taken over various London university campuses. Graeber was, as usual, right there among us. His typically blunt style, he reminded us that no one needs to learn to be a communist. Giving pleasure to those around us and gaining fulfillment from doing so is part of human nature. From each according to his ability to each according to his need, was a principle which all of us would follow when given the chance. All of us, Graeber continued to a rapt audience, feeling a need to laugh and have fun, to express ourselves socially, to be given a chance to fall back on our individuality and creativity, saving the opportunity to establish our own community amongst ourselves and feeling fully proud of it. Graeber's idea of communism as social enjoyment seemed to be refreshingly new and went down well with the crowd. Once again, however, he was breaking new life into ideas that had been around for some time. These ideas were expressed beautifully by the young Karl Marx in his 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts. Marx devoted page after page to the concept of communism as social pleasure. Social pleasure. Insofar as man is human, and thus insofar as his feelings and so on are human, he wrote, this affirmation of the object by another person is equally his own enjoyment. Marx may not have discussed fun in the way Graeber did, but he did certainly write a good deal about enjoyment, which I think is more important than fun anyway. Human productive life, according to Marx, originated as a conscious gift-giving and exchange between human producers, enjoyable for its own sake. Yeah, this is missed by a lot of people who read Capital Volume 1 about alienation. Anyway. Exchange, as he put it, both of human activity within the production itself and also of human products with each other, is equivalent to species activity and species enjoyment, whose real conscious and true being is social activity and social enjoyment. My only problem with this is he's using about species being in a way that's human exclusive. Other animals do this too. Maybe not to the extent we do. And certain kinds of asocial animals don't, but a lot of social animals do. To bring out this point, Marx drew an extended parallel between pleasure in creative work and pleasure in sex. Against this historical background, capitalist wage slavery appears as a cruel distortion, no less paradoxical than the obligation to have sex merely in order to make a living. As Marx put it, prostitution is a particular expression of the general prostitution of the worker. Under communism, socially productive life, species life, as Marx called it, adapting terminology of his intellectual circle, aka Feuerbach, would cease to be experienced by the workers as mere means to their physical survival, becoming once more what it had been in the beginning, social life in its distinctly human form, enjoyable for its own sake. Graeber's mature outlook on politics and anthropology is a seemingly paradoxical combination that it can seem difficult to understand where it all came from. The clue lies in the title of his major fieldwork publication, Lost People, 2007. I haven't read that book. It was his experience in a rural community in central Madagascar that I knew, and it shows up in a lot of his work, that decisively cemented his perspective on social inequality, history, religion, state coercion, the power narrative, and critically grassroots opportunities for resistance. In this rural community, people identified either as Black, known as Manti, or noble, known as Andriana. The Manti were lost people, and being descendants of African slaves, uprooted from their former homes, cut off from the families as they were dispersed and sold to new owners. The Andriana originally came from South Borneo. Attached tenaciously to their ancestor worshipping traditions, they too were lost, but in a different sense. Reticent about their slaveholding past and still reluctant to perform physical work for cash, they became increasingly impoverished when the descendants of their former slaves began to skillfully manage the rising economy of money lending, cash transactions, and trade. Graeber's ethnography describes a world turning upside down as descendants of slaves progressively employ, exploit, and partially expropriate their former masters against the backdrop of a colonial-era state apparatus now so moribund that it is virtually irrelevant. With insight and humor, Graeber describes the dilapidated state of post-colonial near-anarchy, giving each lost person freedom to construct their own narrative in their chosen way, when in effective storytelling, the surest route to confidence building, public support, and some chance of financial success. Among the more economically successful people, one might be an astrologer, for example, whose success rests on special talent for plausible fictions. Graeber then found himself in a world where economic facts seem to be determined by imaginative fictions. This is a far cry from Marx's idea that myths and ideologies are constrained ultimately by economic processes. In Madagascar, the primacy of storytelling seems to make a mockery of any idea of conducting rigorous science. Worse, any attempt to conduct rigorous science seemed to be an external imposition, reinforcing the form-filling addiction of the colonial administrator interested only in regularities. To follow the scientific method, Graeber felt, to close your mind to the surprises and exceptions which make up real life, subordinating people's creative agency to priorities of one's own. In sympathy with his eminent supervisor, the late Marshall Solons, peace be upon him, Graeber resolved not to bend his own creative imagination to such deadening and artificial imperatives. Marshall Solons is a major influence on me too, by the way, if you guys haven't figured that out. For Graeber, setting aside science was a matter according of respect and equality to the people who he was living among. He saw no reason why visiting an anthropologist should set himself up as a mind operating on a higher level. This is a problem with Graeber too. It's a kind of like phony egalitarianism. Anyway, it's not phony, it's aspirational. So decisive that was the fieldwork in shaping his worldview that he went on to apply its lessons everywhere. Human beings who came to exist are by their very nature free agents, not robots or slaves to scientific laws. His reluctance to seek out regularities and norms among the Malagasy became matched in subsequent publications by his reluctance to claim regularities in any field. This led Graeber to dismiss historical materialism, in particular, the idea that history has a sequence of stages. In his view, the alleged simple hunter-gatherers are no more likely to share their land or resources than so-called complex storage hunter-gatherers, farmers, or city dwellers. You see this in the Dawn of Everything book. It's also very misleading the way he sets it up because he doesn't deal with the conditions in which all these societies operate in. He hints at it, just like he hints at it in his Malagasy research, but he doesn't actually dive into it because he rejects the premise that you need to. For Graeber, extant hunter-gatherers are just people who happen to be thrown together by fate, are often marginalized in impoverished, hostile environments, living as best they can and inventing myths as required. We have absolutely no reason to assume the current customs of the Bushmen, of the people of the Kalahari, for example, are generally ancient or teach us anything about our distant past. Graeber does not quite say that today's hunter-gatherers are lost people, but the implication is there. When it comes to human origins, in his view, nothing is to be gained by focusing on hunter-gatherers. Graeber's Madagascarian experience taught him to dismiss any notion of cultural regularities or laws. Irrespective of the prevailing mode of subsistence, people will always be free to choose on alternative political forms. Much of Graeber's late work, co-authored with the archaeologist David Graeber, was an approach to human origins and prehistory molded by these views, in place of the evolutionist assumptions about complexity emerging in communities from simple beginnings. The author argued that the very earliest fully cultural societies, as those of the Othar Paleolithic Europe, were already highly complex. In a controversial article, the authors offered a triumphantly non-Darwinian, explicitly anti-evolutionary account of human origins, which people don't look at. They ignore that there's an anti-evolutionarist tendency, which is also why Graeber makes fun of the idea that we would study primates to understand humans. And actually considers that racist, where I'm like, no, primates are almost as human as us. There's nothing special about us as primates. It's almost weirdly racist to insist on that. Take that, Graeber. How do you like things being turned around on you? Sorry, you're dead. You can't defend yourself, but you never did a good job of it anyway. Because they had no interest in exploring our species early origins in Africa, Wingo and Graeber pictured Homo sapiens as emerging fully formed in Europe during the Othar Paleolithic. Again, this is an old idea, dating to when the Ice Age cave paintings began to be discovered in France. The theory that humans evolved biologically in Africa but did not get smart until they arrived in Europe received its most sophisticated formulation when the hugely influential archaeologist Colin Renfrew made it his own in the 1990s. It's not racist at all. Renfrew insisted that hunter-gatherers were too simple to have developed symbolic culture or language. His most famous evolutionary claim, known as the sapient paradox, was that the speciation of Homo sapiens in Africa was of little interest because our ancestors did not invent language, art, or symbolic culture until they arrived in Europe to spark the Othar Paleolithic revolution tens of millions of years later. And why would it be in the place that a lot of the ancestors of these anthropologies come from, I wonder? I don't know. I don't know what that's about at all. No implicit cultural naturalism there. Anyway. For Renfrew, the hallmark of our species is similarization, characterized by things as complex burials, elaborate works of arts, status differentials, and evidence for governing elites. With top-down imposition of rules and regulations, he argued there can be no social institution, no use of symbols, and therefore no language or symbolic culture. For Renfrew, all this excludes hunter-gatherers, whose cognitive level is too rudimentary for any of this. Hunter-gatherers, he says, leave few signs of their existence, and to the archaeologist are of completely little interest. Well, they would be of little interest to archaeologists because they don't leave a lot of artifacts behind. We don't know what they thought. The archaeologist Ian Watts demolished this entire paradigm some years ago. He pointed out that hunter-gatherers perform rituals and that repeated enactment over immense stretches of time can sometimes leave an archaeological signature. Oh, well, good. There is some evidence. In 2002, Watts was the ochre specialist at the celebrated cave of Blombos, of the celebrated site of the Blombos Caves of Africa, where evidence of the world's first art was discovered. Suck it, Europeanist. The spectacular find consisted of numerous carefully shaped red ochre crayons with sharp points or beveled edges, as if the design would produce a sharp outline of color on a surface. Several of the pieces were decorated with abstract designs. A few years later, in the same cave, evidence for an entire pigment manufacturing workshop was discovered. The shock was that the younger layers in the cave dated to 70,000 years ago, while others reached back to 130,000 years or more. In fact, when Rotz re-examined other African Middle Stone Age sites, it turned out the production of red ochre pigment stretched all the way back to the emergence of Homo sapiens some 300,000 years ago. Most archaeologists now accept Watts' suggestion that body painting for ritual performance is the most likely explanation, and that these discoveries tell us that art and symbolic culture were developed by African hunter-gatherers long before cave painting appeared in Europe. The implications were profound. It simply couldn't be true that our African hunter-gatherer ancestors had little brain power, that symbolic culture was beyond them. They were performing rituals and producing art. This left Renfrew's idea of sapient paradox in ruins. Any discussion of human nature or evolution must follow Darwin, or at least take natural selection into account. This would mean turning to Africa and exploring how our species evolved from ape-like precursors of some kind. After all, humans are a species of great ape, close genetic relatives of chimpanzees and bonobos. No one has ever described a chimpanzee as a libertarian communist. Despite significant variation, chimpanzee politics tends to be male-dominated and despotic, where alpha males sexually coercing females and often murderously attacking their offspring. Groups of kin-related males patrol the boundaries of their range, sometimes invading their neighbors and killing any isolated individuals they find. Chimpanzee psychology is emphatically competitive. So if, during human evolution, all this was turned upside down, then these profound changes can only be described as revolutionary. Evolutionary psychologists, I think we might see the hint in bonobos. I really do. I do think bonobos are like a hint to how that shifted. That's just me, but I think it's pretty obviously there. The evolutionary anthropologist who had done more than anyone else to explore and explain the cooperative nature of our species is Sarah Hardy. The primatologist, too, and the books such as The Woman That Never Evolved, 1981, Mother Nature, 1999, and Mothers and Others, 2009, applied the selfish gene thinking to the study of primate and human evolution, changing everything in the process. Hardy herself stopped short of explaining the emergence of language, art, and symbolic culture. But building on Hardy's insights, Camilla Power and Watts developed a theory which seamlessly extended from biology to a full range of human cultural capacities and accomplishments. Inevitably, there have been heated debates about all this, when Ringrose and Graeber in steadfast opposition. It is worth quoting Power's response to their 2015 article entitled Fairway to the Childhood of Man, where she introduces her alternative hypothesis. Quote, I want to present evidence that gender egalitarianism was pivotal to the evolution of our language-speaking ancestors. I'll ask whether it makes a difference if our modern human bodies and minds evolved through a prolonged period of increasing egalitarianism. Would it help us if we were designed by natural and sexual selection to be happy and healthy in egalitarian conditions? If so, then perhaps the positive question needs to be asked first is not, how did we get to be unequal? But how did we first become equal? It is easy to see why this is a problem for Graeber. According to him, today's followers of Darwin are affected by, quote, their initial assumptions that science demands a rational explanation, that this means attributing rational motives to all behavior, and that a truly rational motivation can only be one that, if observed in humans, would normally be described as selfish or greed. Graeber recommends abandoning Darwin's origins of the species in favor of Kropotkin's mutual aid. As a teenager, I was brought up on Kropotkin and loved it, but to suggest that today's evolutionary scientists should abandon Darwin in favor of Kropotkin's all-pervasive mutual aid is just quixotic. In any case, there is no need. I was exasperated by this fashion on the left for knocking gene-based evolutionary science, making it look as if those who study chimpanzees and bonobos are closet sexist and racist. Yeah, fuck that. I've been bothered by that too. like we're not that special. Quit making humans special. I mean, we are special, but not because of anything anyway. Yes, a gene by definition is a molecule which copied itself. In a purely technical sense, it is selfish. After all, a gene that favored the replication of other genes at its own expense would not be around for very long. But the so-called selfish gene thinking is based on the axiom that a gene can be immortal for simple reasons that is not confined to any single mortal body. Active as in numerous bodies, it will often need to promote cooperation between these in order to survive. During the 1960s and 70s, George C. Williams, William D. Hamilton, Sarah Hardy, Robert Trivers, and other scientific iconoclasts demolished the previous prevailing race against race, so-called group selection understanding of Darwinianism in favor of genetic selection at the individual level. Yeah, this is something that's important about Kropotkin's group selection, is it actually tends to race thinking. And it might explain Kropotkin's own weird response in the Russian Revolution, to be quite frank. Something that many anarchist friends of mine seem pretty hesitant to deal with. All right, since those pioneering times, the cutting-edge Darwinians have focused overwhelmingly on ways to explain why cooperation is so central a feature to the story of life on Earth. Instead of assuming mutual aid as Kropotkin did, they have set out to explain the scientific conditions under which it is likely to occur. Scientists now understand that it is precisely because a creature's immortal genes are present and active in numerous mortal bodies that the logic of self-replication has been able to generate our planet's glorious wonders of self-sacrifice, courage, and generosity, alongside, needless to say, tooth and claw conflict and self-interest. To sum up, the whole point of modern Darwinianism is to get beyond the dog-eat-dog ideas, exploring the conditions under which cooperation prevails. In many ways, in fact, modern Darwinism might be accurately described as the science of solidarity, even perhaps the science of love. After all, sexual selection is as important as natural selection in human beings anyway. It can explain why feelings of love and solidarity don't need to be drilled into us through a system of punishment and reward. And it does. They do need to be modeled, though. Solidarity, which so often motivates our behavior, is instinctive to us. Yes, one of many instincts, but yes. It is clear that our ancestors' generous impulses, and particularly their motivations to care for another's children and not simply their own, made us the successful species we are. That's why we adopt babies so much. We put it another way. What Graeber terms communism involved in the past because it enhances our ancestors' reproductive success, their fitness. Since conclusions along these lines are now part of the mainstream, it seems odd to hear followers of Graeber still complaining that evolutionary science, by its very nature, works on the assumption that humans are incorrigibly selfish. Today, anyone making such crude claims would be displaying their ineptitude and quickly marginalized. Graeber has been described as the Elvis of anthropology, a reference to the fact he successfully subverted his discipline, made it sexy, and became a celebrity in the process. For his activist supporters, his immense popularity stemmed from his courage in breaking taboos. But some of the taboos he liked reinforced other ones. He took pleasure in finding striking exceptions to prevailing stereotypes in our imagined laws. He was willing to take outsiders about matters normally kept secret within their discipline. Graeber accused his professor colleagues of sitting on a vast treasure trove of human experience as if it were something shameful to be kept secret for fear of its political effects. Anthropology, he argued, is a discipline terrified of its own potential, fearful of diverging to students and the public at large a vast range of tried and tested alternatives to capitalism. His was the most fertile and original mind to have ever crashed our discipline, but integrating economics with history, archaeology, and ethnography, he left in much better state than he found it. His sudden and unexpected death in 2020 was a real loss. I do think Graeber's loss is actually significant. I know I mock him a lot. I know I have tons of problems with him. If you hear behind the Patreon wall, there's times I really go after Graeber. I argued with him in public over the debt book in 2012 when it was becoming so popular, because I said that he was careless with categories and weirdly transhistorical and very emotivist, and he mocked me and I mocked him, and we went about our day. I've always found Graeber both provocative and interesting, and about 40% of it I found very useful, but the 60% of it I don't find useful. I actually find that it often subverts what Graeber was even trying to achieve. And thus here we are. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. Read this article. Go read Vulgar too. It's a pretty good rag.